And then I found this true story about the Yeti, the abominable snowman, which spans several decades, involves a Texas oil man, Nepalese monks, a Hollywood movie star, a British primatologist, and the CEO of Air New Zealand. And I thought, this is irresistible. I must tell this story. So, here we go. The story takes place in the Pangbosh village in Nepal, which is near the Everest base camp. Pangbosh is the oldest village in the area of Sagarmatha, which is what the Nepalese call Everest. It's what Everest actually should be called, since it is in Nepal. The Nepalese have a name for it, the Tibetans have a name for it, because the other half is in Tibet, but why it is named after a British imperialist, well, you know that kind of story. That's another story. Anyway, Pangbosh is the oldest village in the area, and in Pangbosh there is a monastery, the Pangbosh Monastery, which is quite modest, but it is the possessor of the Pangbosh hand, a mummified Yeti hand, and a skull bone from the Yeti, presumably. Now the Yeti is the one thing that the Sherpa people of the region fear the most, second only to avalanches. They are deathly afraid of them, as you can understand if you were apt to go up and down that mountain all the time. So in the early 1900s, a steady stream of stories about sightings of this man-bear, or something that might be ape, or something that might be bear, or it might be human, roaming through the mountains. And in the 1920s, an expedition that was headed up Everest saw evidence of something that appeared to be the footprints of a very large man. And a journalist who happened to be camping nearby heard the conversation about these footprints and started talking to one of the Nepalese porters, who used the word Meto Kangmai to describe what they had seen. And he misinterpreted Meto, meaning, which is man. Meto Kangmai is man-bear. But he misinterpreted Meto to mean filthy, which he substituted the word abominable for because he thought it was more poetic. And so our term, abominable snowman, was born from this mistranslation. Well, in the 1950s, it was prime time for Yeti hunting. Everyone wanted to get in on the act, to find this strange phenomenon. And many of these expeditions were funded by a Texas oil man named Tom Slick. Now this isn't how you know that the story is true, because if someone were making up this story, they would not use an obvious name like Slick for the character of oil man. Well, the senior Slick earned his money, his fortune in oil, and then junior Slick gave it to many philanthropic causes and funded expeditions to search for the world's cryptozoological, that's the word, phenomenon, like the North American Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and the Yeti. So he had funded this expedition to the Himalayas, led by an explorer named Peter Byrne from the UK. So Mr. Byrne and his party were camping in the village of Pangbosh, and he heard that this monastery in the village was keeping this Yeti hand and skull. And so he immediately went to the monastery, and the monks gave him a tour and showed him this hand that they claimed belonged to a Yeti. And he described it as a partially mummified hand, which was black and glistening from the oily smoke of the temple lamps. And so he was naturally very excited about this. So he needed to get a message back to Mr. Slick. Well, there was no mail, there was no cable, there was no method of transport, there were no roads. The only way to travel through this area was on the mountain paths. So he hired a young Nepalese runner to run the 100 miles to India, where he could send a cable to Mr. Slick, and he was to wait there until he got a reply. So off he ran, sent the cable saying that the Yeti hand was in the monastery, and waited a few days for the cable to return, and then ran with the message back to Bosch and delivered it to Mr. Byrne. And Mr. Byrne was told that it was imperative that he get the hand, and that he send it back to England to be examined by Dr. Osmond Hill, who was the renowned primatologist. So Mr. Byrne went to the monastery and he asked to borrow the hand. And the lamas said, absolutely not. The hand does not leave the premises. They felt that removing it would upset the local deities and bring them terrible luck. So another message was sent to India, back to Mr. Slick, back to India again, and back to Nepal. And this time, Mr. Byrne was told to come immediately to England for a meeting. Well, immediately means at least a week in these terms, because he had to walk to India and get passage back to London, where he met with Mr. Slick Jr. and Dr. Hill. Well, Mr. Slick said that perhaps the lamas would be willing to give them one finger, or one bone from a finger, and replace it with something else. At which point, Mr. Hill opened a paper bag that he was carrying and tossed a human skeletal hand onto the table amidst the silverware. And so, back went this hand to Nepal, and back to the monastery went Mr. Byrne to make his proposal. Well, the lamas agreed that he could take one finger bone if he were to replace it, and if he were to make a monetary donation to the monastery. And so he gave them 10,000 rupees, and he took a bone from the Yeti's index finger, drilled a hole and wired in the human bone, and all was well. So now, this bone needed to be sent to England. But it is not something that you were allowed to take out of a country. It had to be smuggled. So, Mr. Slick told Mr. Byrne that what he needed to do was to get this bone to Calcutta and to meet Jimmy Stewart. And he would take the bone back to England. So Mr. Byrne went to Calcutta, where Jimmy Stewart, taking a holiday from his grueling filming career, was tiger hunting, which is something that the jet setters did in those days. So Mr. Byrne met Jimmy and Gloria Stewart at the Grand Hotel, and he turned over the bone. I can only imagine how, what it was in. Was it in a test tube? Was it wrapped in a napkin? I don't know. The story didn't tell me these details. I'm thinking of one of those, those glass tubes for cigars, that perhaps it was in one of those. And so, at dinner, he gave them the bone, and they decided that they would smuggle it out of India back to the UK in Mrs. Stewart's lingerie case, something that all elegant ladies carried at the time. And so, the Stewarts left India, and when they arrived in London, Mrs. Stewart's lingerie case was nowhere to be found. And several days later, a customs agent from Her Majesty's Customs Service showed up at the hotel with Mrs. Stewart's lingerie case and handed it over. And this very young, red-faced, star-struck porter swore that no one had peeked at Mrs. Stewart's unmentionables. And the bone was still inside. So it was delivered to Dr. Hill, who proceeded to examine it and do all sorts of tests. Well, there was no DNA testing at that time, of course, and he determined that the bone was not ape, it was not bear, it was not human, but it was hominid, which is a very broad category meaning upright walkers, which includes everything from Neanderthals to modern humans. So that's as close as he could get to determining what it was. Well, a little piece of this bone was given to another scientist who held on to it until the 1990s, when the BBC launched its Unsolved Mysteries program. And they would always look into these sorts of phenomena. So he gave them this piece of bone to study, and they did their testing on it, and their results were inconclusive. They couldn't determine what it was. But if you don't have actual Yeti bone to compare something to, how would you know if that's what it was, right? Well, so back in Nepal, they have this hand with its, substituted piece of bone. And in the 90s, this is when trek tourism really began to pick up in Nepal. And thousands of people scale the mountain every year. But for every one of those, there are hundreds who receive a day pass, a no-stay pass, to hike to the base camp and out again. So this increased the volume of trekkers through the village of Pangbosh greatly. And once this episode of Unsolved Mysteries was aired, everyone wanted to go to the monastery to see the Yeti hand. Bless you. And one day, they disappeared. They were stolen. Now we'll fast forward to 2007, when a mountaineer, who happened to be a pilot for Air New Zealand, was making his own trek up Everest when he happened to hear the story of the monastery and the Pangbosh hand. So he went and found that because its star attraction was gone, the income stream of the monastery had pretty much dried up and the monks were in dire straits. Well, Mr. Alsop, Mike Alsop was his name, he determined that he would do anything to get the hand back to the monastery. So he launched a website called returnthehand.com. And he uses it to collect money for the monastery as well as to spread the word about the missing hand. And he has offered to go anywhere in the world and collect the hand and deliver it back to the monastery, no questions asked. He'll even buy the beers. So he was having dinner one afternoon with the CEO of Air New Zealand when he mentioned this story, and he said that he would like to have a replica of the hand made so that the monastery would have something to show to visitors in the meantime until he had the hand replaced. Well, the CEO of Air New England picks up the phone and he calls Sir Richard Taylor. That name sound familiar to anyone? In my mind, I think Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. So, that's the first place I go. But no, Sir Richard Taylor was knighted because he was the founder of Weta Workshops, which is the design and construction firm that made all the costumes, weapons, and masks for the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So, he is the perfect person for this job, right? So he was very excited about this, and using the photos from the 1950s expedition, he created a model of the hand and the skull. Now, the skull had long been since discredited. They determined that it was the skull of a mountain antelope. So, the story is basically about the hand, but he did recreate the skull bone, too. And Air New Zealand was going to make a big deal out of this. They were going to fly everybody to Nepal. They were going to take a lot of their employees with them and make a big presentation at the monastery in early 2011. But then nature stepped in, and near the end of 2010, there was a massive earthquake in New Zealand. And it just didn't seem like the right thing to do when the whole country was in disaster mode to launch this big trip to deliver a fake hand to a monastery. So it kind of got put on the back burner for a while. But the models were made, and Mike Alsop really wanted to get them there. So very quietly, without any fanfare, in May 2011, he flew to Nepal and delivered these to the monks so that they can be on display in a locked box, of course, so that they won't be stolen again. Well, this whole story was reported in the Toronto Sun in June of 2011. I happened to find it online. It was published in 2 segments. And the reporter who wrote this story, ended there with, "Isn't this wonderful? The monastery has its hand in its skull, and tourism is good, and their income stream is back, and you can still go to returnthehand.com if you have any information or any money that you want to donate." And then this year, disaster strikes in Nepal. And so I started to wonder what might have happened to the monastery. So I started reading the blogs of climbers who were on Everest at the time. And the reports were quite devastating, as we And I found mention in one of the climbers' reports, he's a South African man, that he was headed down the mountain because the mountain has been closed. No one will scale Everest this year. But as he was leaving the area, he was camping near Pangboche and heard the story of the monastery. And so he went, and the monks were not there because they were presiding over a death ceremony for victims of the earthquake. But he did get a tour of the monastery, and he did see the hand and the skull in the latoirs. So we know that the monastery survived, probably due to the protection of the Yeti's hand there. So you know, at least that little bit of Nepal is intact. If you have any information as to the whereabouts of the original Yeti's hand and skull, please contact Mr. Alsop via returnthehand.com. I'm sure he'd be very happy to hear from you. And isn't that just a fascinating thing?